The dining room at my father's house was packed with relatives, every seat taken around the mahogany table that had been in our family for 3 generations. The Easter centerpiece, a ceramic lamb surrounded by pastel eggs and white lilies, sat between platters of honey-glazed ham and bowls of steaming vegetables. My stepmother Judith stood at her place near the head of the table, her perfectly manicured fingers clutching the pearl necklace she wore every Sunday, twisting it the way she always did when she was about to deliver what she considered a righteous judgment. "Even Jesus wouldn't forgive what she's done to this family," Judith declared, her voice carrying that special tone of condemnation wrapped in false concern that she'd perfected over the years. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I watched as heads around the table nodded in agreement. My Aunt Francine pursed her lips and shook her head slowly, while Uncle Morton stared at his plate. My cousin Deanna leaned forward, eager for more drama to unfold. My half-brother Preston pushed back in his chair, that familiar smirk spreading across his face as he added his own poison to the mix. Dad's life was definitely better before she came back into it, more peaceful, more stable. Now look at him, sick all the time, stressed beyond belief. He gestured toward my father, who sat quietly at the head of the table, his face pale and drawn, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass. I sat there in my assigned seat, the one furthest from my father, carefully cutting my daughter Hazel's ham into small, manageable pieces. The knife moved steadily through the meat while inside my chest, my heart pounded with the effort of keeping silent. I'd promised myself I wouldn't react, wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Not today, not at Easter dinner, not in front of my daughter. "Mommy, I want more mashed potatoes," Hazel whispered beside me, and I spooned another helping onto her plate, grateful for the distraction, for something normal to focus on while the character assassination continued around me. "The Bible says honor thy father and mother," Judith continued, warming to her theme now that she had an audience. "But some people only come around when they need something, when their own choices have left them desperate." That's when I noticed Hazel had stopped eating. She was looking around the table, her 6-year-old face serious and contemplative, taking in every word, every cruel implication. Before I could distract her, before I could suggest we go wash our hands or take a little break, she pushed back her small chair and climbed up onto it, her Easter dress bunching around her knees, her white patent leather shoes careful on the cushion. "Grandma Judith," Hazel said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the adult conversation like a bell. Every head turned toward her. "Should I tell Mommy about what you and Preston put in Grandpa's medicine cabinet last week?" The question landed like a bomb in the middle of the Easter table. Judith's hand froze on her pearls. Preston's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by something that looked like panic. My father's water glass stopped halfway to his lips. "When you thought I was napping on the couch," Hazel continued, standing taller now, her small hands on her hips in a gesture she'd learned from me. "When you were whispering about the pills and the papers and making sure Grandpa stayed tired." The clinking of silverware stopped completely. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to pause its steady ticking. The smell of ham and sweet potatoes suddenly felt cloying, heavy in the absolute silence that followed my daughter's words. Aunt Francine's mouth fell open. Deanna's fork hovered halfway to her mouth. Uncle Morton set down his wineglass with excessive care, as if afraid any sound might shatter the moment. I looked at my daughter, this brave little girl in her lavender dress with the ribbon sash, standing on her chair like a tiny warrior, facing down an army of adults who should have known better. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't backing down. She was simply standing there, waiting for an answer to her question, as if she'd asked something as simple as whether there would be ice cream for dessert. "What are you talking about, child?" Judith's voice came out strangled, high-pitched, nothing like her usual controlled tone of moral superiority. "The white pills," Hazel said simply. "The ones you put in instead of the pink ones. Preston said it would keep Grandpa from arguing about something important. You said just a little longer until everything was transferred. I remember because you spelled out a big word thinking I wouldn't understand. Powerfattorney. But I'm learning to read, and I remembered the letters." My mind was racing. medical training colliding with maternal instinct, colliding with daughterly fear. I looked at my father, really looked at him for the first time since I'd arrived. The trembling hands I'd attributed to age, the fatigue everyone blamed on stress, the confusion he'd shown lately that Judith insisted was related to my return. Every symptom suddenly rearranged itself into a different, terrifying picture. "Gerald," Aunt Francine whispered, her voice breaking the spell. "What is she talking about?" My father set down his water glass with shaking hands, his eyes moving from Hazel to Judith to Preston, and finally to me. "I don't know," he said slowly, "but I think we're about to find out." Hazel climbed down from her chair with the same careful dignity she'd shown climbing up. She walked around the table, past the relatives who sat frozen like statues, past the Easter lamb centerpiece that now seemed to mock the whole facade of this family gathering, and stopped directly in front of her grandfather. She took his trembling hand in both of her small ones. "I'm sorry I didn't tell sooner, Grandpa," she said, her voice wobbling just a little now. "But Grandma Judith said if I told anyone, she'd make sure Mommy could never visit again. She said she had friends who were judges, and they would believe whatever she told them. But Miss Patterson at Sunday school says lying is wrong, even if grown-ups tell you to do it, and making someone sick is even worse than lying, isn't it?" The room erupted. Francine gasped. Morton stood up so fast his chair tipped backward. Deanna's wine glass knocked over, spreading red across the white tablecloth like blood. And through it all, Judith and Preston sat frozen, their faces drained of all color, their elaborate deception unraveling by the clear, honest words of a 6-year-old child who had decided that protecting her grandfather was more important than keeping adult secrets. 3 months earlier, I'd pulled into my father's driveway with everything I owned, packed into a rental truck, and my daughter, asleep in her booster seat. The February rain was coming down steady, turning the familiar street of my childhood into something that looked both exactly the same and completely different. The divorce papers had been finalized just 2 weeks before, ending 5 years of a marriage that had slowly stripped away everything I thought I knew about myself. My ex-husband Connor had been charming at first, the kind of man who knew exactly what to say to make you feel like you were the only person in the world who mattered. But charm turned to control so gradually I hadn't seen it happening. First, it was suggestions about not visiting my family so often because we needed to build our own life together. Then it became arguments about phone calls to my father, accusations that I was too dependent, too needy, that my family was toxic and holding me back. By year 3, I'd stopped fighting it. By year 4, I barely spoke to anyone from home except for stilted holiday cards that Connor would review before I sent them. The breaking point came when he raised his hand to Hazel. He didn't hit her, but the gesture, the threat of it, while she cowered in the corner crying over spilled juice, shattered whatever spell I'd been under. I filed for divorce the next day, and when the judge awarded me full custody with supervised visitation for Connor, I knew it was time to go home. "Vera, honey, you look so thin," my father had said when he opened the door that rainy February afternoon, pulling me into a hug that smelled like Old Spice and coffee, exactly the way I remembered. "Hi, Dad," I'd managed, feeling 6 years old again instead of 32. He'd aged in the 5 years I'd been mostly absent. His hair had gone completely gray, and there were deep lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But his smile was the same, warm and welcoming and without a trace of the judgment I'd expected. "Where's my granddaughter?" he'd asked, peering past me toward the truck. "Sleeping." It was a long drive. From Portland. "Well, let's get her inside before she catches cold. Judith's at her book club, but she'll be home soon." That should have been my first warning, the way his face changed slightly when he mentioned his wife, but I was too exhausted and grateful to notice. He helped me carry Hazel inside, settling her on the couch in the living room that had been redecorated in shades of beige and cream. Nothing like the warm blues and greens my mother had chosen before she died when I was 15. Over the next few weeks, I'd thrown myself into rebuilding. I'd gotten the nursing job at Riverside General, working in the cardiac unit where my training from Portland transferred seamlessly. The 12-hour shifts were long, but they meant I had 4 days a week with Hazel, and the pay was enough to afford a small apartment near the good elementary school. "You're working too much," my father said during one of our coffee dates at the diner downtown. His hand shook slightly as he stirred sugar into his cup, and I made a mental note to ask about his medications. I need to prove I can do this, Dad, on my own. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, sweetheart. You're home. That's what matters. But Judith had different opinions, and she shared them freely whenever we gathered for Sunday dinners. A broken home is so hard on children, she'd say, watching Hazel play with her food. Studies show they need stability, routine, a proper family structure. Preston, who'd moved back in after failing out of his third attempt at business school, would always chime in with his own observations. Maybe if you weren't working such crazy hours, Vera, kids need their mothers present, not just physically, but emotionally available. This from a 25-year-old who'd never held a job longer than 3 months and spent his days playing video games in my father's basement. I'd noticed changes in my father beyond the normal aging. He'd always been sharp, quick with jokes and stories, but lately he seemed foggy, confused about dates and appointments. It's the stress, Judith explained to anyone who asked. Having Vera back, all the drama with her situation, it's taking a toll on poor Gerald. She'd positioned herself as the long-suffering wife, caring for an increasingly frail husband while dealing with his problem daughter who'd returned home in disgrace. At church, at the grocery store, at family gatherings, she painted a picture of dysfunction that I was too exhausted and overwhelmed to counter. The week before Easter, everything had accelerated. Dad had collapsed in the garden, his heart rhythm erratic, his blood pressure dangerously low. The hospital had kept him for 3 days, running test after test, finding nothing conclusive except that his medications seemed to be interacting strangely. Sometimes these things happen with age, Dr. Rodriguez had said, but she'd pulled me aside afterward. Your father's symptoms are unusual. Has there been any change in his routine? New supplements? Different pharmacy? I don't know, I'd admitted. Judith manages his medications. The doctor had frowned but said nothing more. Looking back, I should have pushed harder, should have asked more questions. But I was trying so hard to not be the difficult daughter, the one who caused problems, the one who'd already failed at so much. Easter dinner was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to show everyone that I was grateful to be home, that I could be part of the family again without causing chaos. I'd arrived early to help cook, bringing Hazel in her new dress, the one my father had secretly bought her on their last grandfather-granddaughter date. I'd smiled through Judith's passive-aggressive comments about my cooking. I'd ignored Preston's snide remarks about single mothers. I'd been determined to make it through one family meal without drama. I should have known better. Some secrets are too poisonous to stay buried, and sometimes it takes the innocence of a child to reveal just how deep the rot goes. Easter dinner was supposed to be perfect. I'd arrived at noon, 3 hours early, determined to help with every preparation and prove I could be a positive part of this family again. The April sun streamed through the kitchen windows as I peeled potatoes, the familiar rhythm of the work soothing my nerves, while Hazel sat at the breakfast nook coloring pictures for everyone's place settings. Those carrots need to be cut smaller, Judith said, hovering behind me. Gerald's digestion isn't what it used to be. We have to be careful about everything he eats now. Of course, I said, reshaping carrots that were already perfectly fine. How has he been feeling this week? Oh, good days and bad days. The doctor adjusted his medications again. Preston's been wonderful about organizing all his pills. Such a devoted son. Preston walked in then, yawning despite it being past noon. Is there coffee? In the pot, dear, Judith cooed. Did you remember to give Gerald his morning medications? Yeah, all done, he said, pouring coffee and leaving his dirty spoon on the counter I'd just cleaned. Hey, Vera, heard you had to work late 3 times this week. Must be hard on Hazel. I had one emergency surgery that ran over, I corrected. Hazel was with Dad. They had a movie night. Still, children need consistency, he said, echoing his mother's favorite refrain. That's why I make sure I'm always here for Gerald, someone he can count on. By the time relatives started arriving at 3, the tension in the house was already thick. Aunt Francine swept in with her famous green bean casserole and immediately started her inspection. Vera, you look tired, dear. Are you taking care of yourself? And Hazel, sweetie, that's a pretty dress, though it seems a bit fancy for a child, doesn't it? Uncle Morton gave me a sympathetic pat on the shoulder but said nothing, as usual. Cousin. Deanna arrived last, armed with wine and an eager expression that meant she was ready for whatever family drama might unfold. We gathered in the living room for appetizers, and that's when the real performance began. Judith held court from her chair near the fireplace, managing to work my divorce into every conversation topic. When Francine mentioned her church's new pastor, Judith sighed about broken marriage vows. When Morton talked about his retirement plans, she commented on the importance of stability for children. When Deanna shared news about her promotion, Judith praised her for focusing on career, unlike some people who throw away their opportunities. "How's Gerald doing?" Francine asked, and suddenly the room's attention shifted to my father, who sat quietly in his recliner, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. "It's been challenging," Judith said, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "The stress of recent changes has really affected his health. The doctor says emotional upheaval can be devastating at his age." "I've been sick for months," my father said quietly, "before Vera came home." "Yes, dear, but it's gotten so much worse," Judith corrected smoothly. "Preston and I have been managing everything, haven't we? Making sure you take your medications, rest properly, avoid stress." "Speaking of which," Preston added, "Dad, you should probably skip the ham tonight." "Your stomach was upset yesterday, remember?" My father looked confused. "Was it? I don't remember." "Of course it was," Judith said firmly. "You're forgetting things more often lately. The doctor said that's normal with your condition." "What condition?" I asked, my nursing instincts finally overriding my desire to keep peace. "What exactly has the doctor diagnosed?" "Oh, various things," Judith waved dismissively. "Heart problems, blood pressure issues, some cognitive decline. It's all very complicated. Medical professionals like you probably see it all the time in elderly patients." "Dad's only 68, I said. "Yes, well, some people age faster than others, especially when they've had difficult lives," she responded, the implication clear. When we moved to the dining room for dinner, Judith orchestrated the seating so I was at the far end, separated from my father by the entire length of the table. Hazel sat beside me, quietly observing everything with those watchful eyes she'd developed during the last turbulent years with Connor. The prayer before dinner was pointed, Judith thanking God for family members who stay faithful and present, and asking for forgiveness for those who stray from righteousness. The amens around the table were subdued, uncomfortable, but no one challenged her. As plates were passed and wine was poured, Aunt Francine launched into her prepared speech about the sanctity of marriage. "I just don't understand this generation," she said, not looking at me directly, but ensuring everyone knew who she meant. "In my day, we understood commitment. We didn't just leave when things got difficult." "Sometimes leaving is necessary for safety," I said quietly, thinking of Connor's raised hand, of Hazel's tears. "Safety?" Judith's voice rose. Was it safe to drag a child away from her father? Was it safe to disrupt her entire life because you couldn't make your marriage work? "You don't know the situation," I started, but she cut me off. "I know enough. I know you abandoned this family for 5 years. I know Gerald spent countless nights wondering what he'd done wrong to drive you away. I know you only came back when you had nowhere else to go." "That's not true," my father said weakly, but Judith patted his hand dismissively. "Don't upset yourself, dear. Your heart can't take it." His heart was fine until recently, I observed, watching the interplay between Judith and Preston, the way they kept exchanging glances. "How would you know?" Preston challenged. "You weren't here. Mom and I have been managing his care for months, making sure he takes the right pills at the right times, monitoring his symptoms, keeping him calm and stable." "Yes," Judith added, her voice taking on that sanctimonious tone again. "Even Jesus wouldn't forgive what she's done to this family." The words hung in the air like a curse. Several relatives nodded, Francine pursing her lips in agreement, Deanna leaning forward eagerly to catch every word of the unfolding drama. "Dad's life was definitely better without her," Preston added, his smirk firmly in place. "More peaceful, less complicated. Now look at him, declining rapidly since she returned." I sat there, cutting Hazel's ham with mechanical precision, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. Every instinct screamed at me to defend myself, to point out the holes in their story, to demand real answers about my father's sudden decline. But I'd learned with Connor that fighting back sometimes made things worse, that staying quiet could be a form of survival. That's when I felt Hazel's small hand on my arm, her voice cutting through my spiral of thoughts. "Mommy, why is everyone being mean to you?" The question was innocent, clear, and it sliced through the adult pretensions like a blade. Everyone turned to look at my 6-year-old daughter, this small truth-teller in her lavender dress, and for a moment the masks around the table slipped. I saw uncertainty in Francine's eyes, discomfort in Morton's expression, even a flicker of shame in Deanna's face. But Judith recovered quickly, her voice syrupy sweet. "Oh, honey, we're not being mean. We're just having an adult conversation about complicated things." Hazel looked at her grandmother with those serious eyes that had seen too much for her age. "Miss Patterson says when people say mean things about someone who isn't doing anything wrong, that's called bullying. And bullying is always mean, even when adults do it." I set down my fork with deliberate care, the soft clink against the china, plate the only sound in the room. My hands moved to my napkin, folding it precisely as I prepared to do what I'd done so many times before. Retreat. Take Hazel and leave quietly, avoiding further confrontation, protecting my daughter from another scene of adult cruelty. It was the same pattern I'd followed with Connor for years, the same response Judith expected from me now. "Hazel, sweetheart, let's go wash your hands," I said softly, already pushing back my chair. "But my hands aren't dirty, Mommy," Hazel replied, her voice still carrying that clear, innocent tone that had just called out the entire table. "And neither are yours. Why do we have to leave? We haven't had dessert yet. Grandpa said there would be lemon cake." "Sometimes it's better to leave before dessert," I said, reaching for her hand. But Hazel pulled away, something fierce and determined flashing in her young eyes. "No, Mommy, you always do this. When people are mean, you just leave, but that means the mean people win." "Hazel, this isn't the time," I started, aware that every eye in the room was on us. "When is the time?" she asked, and the question hit me like a physical blow. Daddy was mean and we left, but these people are being mean too, and they're telling lies about you. Grandma Judith is lying. Judith's face flushed red, her hand going to her pearl necklace. "Young lady, I don't appreciate being called a liar by a child who doesn't understand adult situations." "But I do understand," Hazel insisted, standing up on her chair now, gaining height as if it would give her words more power. "I understand that you told Mommy not to visit. I heard you on the phone last Christmas. You said if she came for the holidays, you'd make sure she felt so unwelcome she'd never come back. That's ridiculous," Judith sputtered. But I saw Preston shift uncomfortably in his seat. "And I understand that you told people at church that Mommy was a bad mother," Hazel continued, her voice gaining strength. "Mrs. Henderson told Mommy at the grocery store. She said you told everyone at Bible study that Mommy abandoned Grandpa and that she was raising me without proper values." "Hazel, please sit down," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Part of me, the part I'd buried under years of Connor's manipulation and Judith's passive aggression, wanted to hear what else my daughter had observed. "No, Mommy, they need to know the truth." Hazel turned to face the table full of relatives. "Grandma Judith doesn't want Mommy here. She never did. She told Preston that once Mommy was completely out of the picture, everything would be easier." "The child is making things up," Preston said, but his usual smirk was gone, replaced by something that looked like worry. "I don't make things up," Hazel said firmly. "Miss Patterson at Sunday school says lying is a sin, and keeping bad secrets is like lying too." My father, who had been silent through this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "What secrets? Sweetheart? What bad secrets?" Hazel turned to look at her grandfather, and I saw her small shoulders straighten with resolve. "The secret about your medicine, Grandpa, about what they did to your pills." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Judith went rigid in her chair. Preston's hand knocked over his wine glass, red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth. "What about my medicine?" my father asked, his voice stronger than it had been all evening. "Should I tell Mommy?" Hazel asked me directly, even though Grandma Judith said she'd make sure you couldn't see us anymore if I did? The threat hit me like ice water. I looked at Judith, really looked at her, and saw not the concerned stepmother she pretended to be, but someone capable of using a 6-year-old child to maintain her deceptions. My nursing instincts, my maternal rage, and my long suppressed backbone all collided in that moment. "Yes, baby," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Tell us everything. No more secrets." Hazel nodded solemnly. "Last Tuesday, when Mommy had to work late for the emergency surgery, I stayed here with Grandpa. He let me watch cartoons and made me mac and cheese. But I fell asleep on the couch, and when I woke up, Grandma Judith and Preston were in the kitchen. They didn't know I was awake." "This is absurd." Judith started to stand, but Francine, of all people, spoke up. "Let the child speak," she said, her voice sharp. "If she's lying, we'll know soon enough." Hazel continued, her words careful and precise, the way she recited her spelling words for school. "Preston had Grandpa's pill organizer, the one with the days of the week on it. He was dumping out pills into a plastic baggie. Pink pills. Grandma Judith gave him different pills from a bottle in her purse. White ones." "Those were vitamins," Preston said quickly. "Dad's doctor recommended vitamins." "No," Hazel said simply, "because Grandma Judith said, 'These will keep him docile for the lawyer meeting.' I didn't know what docile meant, so I remembered it to look up later. It means easy to control." My medical training kicked in fully now. Docile. Sedatives. The symptoms I'd been seeing in my father suddenly formed a clear, terrifying picture. The confusion, the weakness, the irregular heartbeat that mysteriously appeared and disappeared. "And then Preston said something about power of attorney," Hazel continued. "He spelled it out, thinking I couldn't understand. POWEROFATTORNEY. He said once they had it, they could move the money before anyone noticed Grandpa was getting worse." "That's enough," Judith shrieked, standing so fast her chair tipped backward. "I won't sit here and be accused by a child with an overactive imagination." "Then you won't mind if we check Dad's medication right now," I said, standing as well. "I'm a cardiac nurse. I know what his pills should look like. If Hazel's wrong, we can all apologize and move on." "You have no right," Preston started, but my father's voice cut through everything. "Vera, go check my pills. Now." His voice was firm, commanding, more like the father I remembered from before his mysterious illness. "The bottle with the blue cap, my heart medication. Check it now." I moved toward the stairs, but Preston stepped in my way. "This is ridiculous. You can't just believe a kid's fantasy." "Move," I said, my voice low and dangerous, channeling every moment of strength I'd had to find to leave Connor, to rebuild my life, to protect my daughter. "Or I call 911 right now and let the police sort it out." Morton stood up then, all 6 feet of him, usually silent but now imposing. "Preston, step aside. Let her check." Preston looked to his mother, but Judith was backing toward the door, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. "This is insane. We're leaving." "No," Francine said, moving to block the dining room exit. "You're not going anywhere until we know the truth." I pushed past Preston and ran up the stairs, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and vindication. In my father's bathroom, I found his medication organizer. With shaking hands, I opened Thursday's compartment. The pills that should have been pink were white. Friday's compartment, the same. Saturday, Sunday, all white pills where pink ones should be. I grabbed the bottle with the blue cap, examining the pills inside under the bathroom light. My worst fears were confirmed. These weren't his prescribed heart medication. They looked like high-dose sedatives, the kind that, mixed with actual heart medication, would cause exactly the symptoms my father had been experiencing. I pulled out my phone, taking pictures of everything before carefully placing several pills in a tissue. Evidence. We would need evidence. When I returned to the dining room, the scene was frozen in a tableau of tension. Judith and Preston were still trying to edge toward the door. My father sat rigid in his chair. The relatives were scattered between disbelief and dawning horror. And in the center of it all, my 6-year-old daughter stood on her chair like a tiny guardian angel, having chosen truth over threats, courage over comfort. "These aren't your heart pills, Dad," I said, holding up the bottle. "These are sedatives, strong ones. Mixed with your actual medication, they would cause confusion, weakness, and heart irregularities. Exactly what you've been experiencing." The room erupted, but I kept my focus on my father, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. "We need to get you to the hospital, now, and then we're calling the police." The silence that followed my announcement lasted exactly 3 seconds before Judith's carefully constructed facade shattered completely. She lunged toward the table, grabbing for the pill bottle in my hand, her perfectly manicured nails scratching across my wrist as I pulled it away. "Those are his prescribed medications," she screamed, her voice high and desperate. "You don't know what you're talking about. You've been gone for 5 years." "I'm a cardiac nurse," I said, holding the bottle high above her reach. "I know exactly what digoxin looks like, and these aren't digoxin pills. These are benzodiazepines, sedatives that, when mixed with heart medication, can cause exactly the symptoms Dad's been having." Preston made a move toward me, but Morton stepped between us, his usually passive demeanor replaced with protective anger. "Don't even think about it, boy." "Dad, we need to call 911 now," I said, already pulling out my phone with my free hand. "You need to be evaluated immediately. The interaction between these drugs and your actual medication could cause serious damage." "This is ridiculous," Judith shrieked, spinning toward my father. "Gerald, you can't believe this. I'm your wife. I've taken care of you." My father stood slowly, his hand gripping the edge of the table for support. When he looked at Judith, his eyes were clear for the first time in months. "You told me Vera didn't want to see me. You said she was too ashamed to visit. You deleted her emails, didn't you?" "I was protecting you," Judith claimed, tears streaming down her face, but they looked more like tears of rage than sorrow. "She abandoned you. She chose that man over her family." "No," Hazel said, still standing on her chair, her small voice cutting through the chaos. "Mommy sent letters. I helped her write them. She drew pictures for Grandpa every week, but you sent them back. I saw them in the mailbox, with her turn to sender written on them in your handwriting." Deanna had her phone out, recording everything. "I'm getting all of this," she announced. "Every word." "Turn that off," Preston shouted, but Francine stepped beside her daughter. "Keep recording," she commanded. "We'll need evidence." I was already on the phone with 911, my professional voice taking over. "We need an ambulance and police at 447 Maple Street. Possible medication tampering and elder abuse. The victim is a 68-year-old male who's been given unauthorized sedatives mixed with cardiac medication." "She's lying!" Judith screamed. "Preston, tell them she's lying." But Preston had gone silent, his face gray as he sank into his chair. He knew they were caught. The game was over. "Grandpa, there's more," Hazel said, climbing down from her chair and walking to my father. "They were talking about your will. Grandma Judith said once they had the power of attorney thing, they could change everything before you got better. Only you weren't supposed to get better." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" my father asked, kneeling down to her level despite his weakness. "Preston said the doses would keep increasing until you either signed everything or—" Hazel paused, looking at me uncertainly. "Tell him, baby," I encouraged, my hand on her shoulder. "Or until you died," she finished quietly. "He said it would look natural because of your heart problems. Nobody would question it." Francine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Morton cursed under his breath, something I'd never heard him do in 20 years. Even Deanna stopped recording for a moment, too shocked to continue. "You were killing him," I said, the full weight of the realization hitting me. "You were slowly murdering my father for his money." "We weren't," Judith protested, but her denial was weak, desperate. "We were just managing his health. He's old, confused." "I'm neither," my father said, his voice stronger now, fueled by rage. "But I have been drugged, apparently. How long, Judith? How long have you been poisoning me?" "Since January," Hazel answered when neither Judith nor Preston spoke. "I heard them talking about it at New Year's. They said 3 months should be enough to get everything transferred without raising suspicions." The sirens were getting closer now, and Judith made one last desperate attempt at control. "Gerald, please, we can work this out privately. Think of the scandal. Think of what people will say." "I'm thinking of what almost happened," he replied coldly. "I'm thinking of how I almost died believing my daughter abandoned me, when really my wife was trying to steal everything I built to leave to my children." The paramedics arrived first, immediately beginning their assessment of my father. I handed over the pills, explaining the situation in medical terms while they checked his vitals. His blood pressure was erratic, his heart rate inconsistent, all symptoms that aligned with benzodiazepine interaction with cardiac medication. The police arrived minutes later, 2 officers who listened to the story with growing alarm. When Hazel repeated what she'd witnessed, one officer immediately called for a detective. "We'll need to take these medications as evidence," the officer said, carefully bagging the pills, "and we'll need statements from everyone here." "This is entrapment," Judith screamed. "That child was coached." Vera put her up to this. "Ma'am, we'll investigate all possibilities," the officer said calmly. "But right now, we need you and your son to come with us for questioning." "I want a lawyer," Preston said immediately. "That's your right," the officer replied, "but you'll need to come with us either way." As they led Judith and Preston out in handcuffs, Judith turned back one last time. "Your mother would be ashamed of you, Vera. Destroying a family like this." "My mother would be proud that I protected my father," I shot back, "and she would be disgusted by what you tried to do to him." The paramedics insisted on taking my father to the hospital for observation and to flush the unauthorized medications from his system. As they loaded him onto the gurney, he reached for my hand. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he said, tears in his eyes. "I should have known. I should have trusted you. We'll talk about it later, Dad. Right now, let's just get you better." Hazel tugged on his other hand. "Grandpa, are you mad at me for telling?" He pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "You saved my life, little one. You're the bravest person in this whole family." As the ambulance pulled away, I stood in the driveway holding Hazel's hand, surrounded by shell-shocked relatives. The Easter dinner had been destroyed, the family secret exposed, and 2 people who'd pretended to be caregivers were heading to jail. "Mommy," Hazel said quietly, "was I wrong to keep the secret for so long?" I knelt down to her level, looking into those wise young eyes. "You told the truth when it mattered most. You spoke up when someone you loved was in danger. That takes incredible courage, especially when adults threatened you." "Grandma Judith isn't really my grandma, is she?" Hazel asked. "No, baby, she's not. Family isn't just about who you're related to or married to. It's about who protects you, who loves you honestly, who stands up for what's right, even when it's scary." Francine approached us then, her face tear-stained and remorseful. "Vera, I owe you such an apology. We all do. We believed her lies, every one of them." "You didn't know," I said, though part of me wanted to ask why they'd been so ready to believe the worst about me. "No, we should have questioned it. You were never the person she described. And this precious child?" She looked at Hazel with wonder. "She has more integrity than all of us adults combined." 3 weeks later, I sat in my father's living room, but it looked nothing like the somber space Judith had created. The heavy curtains were gone, replaced with sheer white ones that let the morning light flood in. The stiff beige furniture had been donated to charity, and now comfortable, colorful pieces filled the room. My mother's paintings were back on the walls, and fresh flowers sat on every surface, just like she used to arrange them. Dad looked like a different person entirely. His color had returned, his hands were steady, and his eyes were sharp and clear. The proper medication, combined with the removal of the sedatives, had restored him to the father I remembered from my childhood. He was reading a story to Hazel, doing all the voices, making her giggle the way he used to make me laugh when I was her age. "The district attorney called this morning," Dad said, looking up from the book. "Judith and Preston took the plea deal. 5 years for elder abuse, fraud, and attempted murder. They'll serve at least 3. "That's less than they deserve," I said, curling my legs under me on the couch. "It's enough," he replied. "They've lost everything. The divorce was finalized yesterday. She gets nothing, not even the car she loved so much, and Preston's facing additional charges for prescription fraud. Turns out he'd been stealing and selling my medications for months before they started the sedative scheme." The investigation had revealed the full extent of their plan. They'd been slowly transferring money from Dad's accounts, had already changed several beneficiaries on his insurance policies, and were days away from getting power of attorney when Hazel exposed them. The detective said if they'd succeeded, Dad would have been dead within 2 months, and it would have looked like natural causes. I keep thinking about how ready everyone was to believe her lies about me, I admitted, watching Hazel draw at the coffee table. Fear and shame are powerful tools, Dad said. She knew exactly how to manipulate everyone's existing prejudices. Your divorce made you an easy target. She painted herself as the devoted wife and me as the abandoned father. People want simple stories, even when the truth is complicated. Aunt Francine had called every day since Easter, apologizing profusely. She'd even started defending me at church when people gossiped, telling everyone how Judith had fooled them all. Morton had helped Dad find a good lawyer to untangle the financial mess. Even Deanna, for all her love of drama, had become a fierce advocate, sharing the video she'd recorded to prove to doubters what really happened. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Dad continued. "How Hazel knew something was wrong and held on to that truth, even when threatened. Most adults would have been too scared to speak up." "She gets that from you," I said. "You always taught me to stand up for what's right." "I forgot that lesson for a while," he admitted. "I let Judith convince me that keeping peace was more important than seeking truth. I won't make that mistake again." Hazel looked up from her drawing. "Grandpa, are you going to get married again?" He laughed, a real deep laugh that I hadn't heard in years. "No, sweetheart, I think I'll just focus on being the best grandpa possible. Speaking of which, I've been thinking. Vera, that apartment you're renting is too small. Why don't you and Hazel move in here? This house is too big for just me, and I'd love to have you both close." "Dad, are you sure?" I asked, though my heart leaped at the offer. I've never been more sure of anything. We lost 5 years because of lies and manipulation. I don't want to waste another day. We moved in the following week. The house that had felt like a prison under Judith's rule became a real home again. Hazel's artwork covered the refrigerator, her toys scattered across the living room. The formal dining room where that horrible Easter dinner had taken place became Hazel's art and homework station. We ate meals together at the kitchen table, laughing and talking without fear of judgment or hidden agendas. My father's health improved dramatically. Within a month, he was gardening again, taking Hazel to the park, even joining a seniors tennis group. The doctor was amazed at his recovery, though she said she'd seen similar cases where removing toxic medications and toxic people had miraculous effects. One evening, as I tucked Hazel into bed in what used to be my childhood room, now decorated with butterfly decals and twinkle lights, she asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Mommy, was I wrong to be scared of Grandma Judith?" "No, baby. Your instincts were protecting you. You knew something was wrong even when all the adults missed it." "But I kept the secret for a while because I was scared she'd take you away." I sat on her bed, smoothing her hair. "Sometimes we have to be strategic about when to speak up. You waited until you knew people would listen, when Grandpa could hear you directly. That wasn't keeping a bad secret. That was being smart about revealing the truth. Like how you waited to leave Daddy until you knew we could be safe. Children understand more than we give them credit for. Exactly like that." As I turned off her light, she called out, "Mommy." I'm glad we came home. "Me too, baby, me too." The truth is that Easter dinner taught us all something valuable. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it wears pearls and quotes scripture. Sometimes it smiles while poisoning your coffee. Sometimes it comes from the people who claim to love you most. But truth has a way of surfacing, often through the most unexpected voices. My father recovered fully, and our relationship became stronger than it had ever been. He never missed one of Hazel's school events, never forgot to call just to say he loved us. The family that had been so quick to judge slowly rebuilt around a foundation of honesty instead of appearances. And Judith's final words, that even Jesus wouldn't forgive what I'd done? She was wrong. What I'd done was raise a daughter brave enough to speak truth to power, strong enough to protect those she loved, and wise enough to know that real family isn't about blood or marriage certificates. It's about choosing to stand up for each other, especially when it's hard, especially when there's risk, especially when everyone else is choosing comfortable lies over difficult truths. That's not unforgivable. That's love in its purest, most powerful form. And it's a lesson I'll make sure Hazel never forgets, no matter how many Judiths she encounters in her life. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to stand up to toxic family members or found the courage to speak truth when everyone wanted you to stay silent, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Your stories matter, and sharing them helps others know they're not alone in these struggles. Please take a moment to like this video if it touched your heart and share it with someone who might need to hear that their voice matters, no matter how small it might seem. Sometimes the youngest, quietest voices speak the loudest truths. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful, real-life stories about families, courage, and the unexpected moments that change everything. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might just change your perspective on what real strength looks like. Remember, family isn't about keeping toxic peace. It's about protecting each other, especially when the threat comes from within. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.